I'm a doctoral candidate here at the University of Sydney, and I'm also an associate of the Sydney Democracy Network, and it's really my pleasure to be chairing this event this evening. And this evening's talk is going to be talking about political protests in Hong Kong. Now, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and it's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. And I'd also like to thank my colleagues at the Sydney Democracy Network for organizing this event, along with the China Studies Centers who are co-hosts this evening. And I urge all of you to take a look at the events that they're organizing upcoming this year. They're always excellent, so take a peek at those. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce us to today's session and our esteemed guest, Antony Dapiran, who's going to be tackling the central theme of this evening, Hong Kong, City of Protest. Hong Kong, the money pit, a place of decadence, a showcase for China, a business platform, and a laboratory for neoliberalism. These are all familiar tropes that have been used over the past few decades to describe the territory. But 2014's Occupy Central movement was a major political upheaval in the territory, as well as a mediated event of global significance. And it really worked to shatter these illusory narratives that have proven to have immense staying power, not only in the international media, but also in people's imaginations. Yet several years on from Occupy Central, Hong Kong's future appears increasingly uncertain in light of a looming Beijing, who's seeking to draw Hong Kong closer, ever tighter into its dragnet of control. And here to stitch these themes together tonight, with a much-needed look back at Hong Kong's rich history of civil disobedience movements, is our guest speaker this evening, Antony Dapiran. Antony is a Hong Kong-based lawyer and author who was educated at the University of Melbourne and Peking University. One of the leading corporate finance lawyers in the Greater China market, Antony has advised on capital markets transactions that have been transformational for the China business landscape. Antony also writes and publishes extensively on China and Hong Kong business, politics, and culture. And he has recently had a book published by Penguin entitled City of Protest, A Recent History of Dissent in Hong Kong, that really pokes holes in the widely held myth of Hong Kong as this apolitical business zone. And he does so by shedding light on the territory's boisterous, yet often ignored politics. So it's our great pleasure to have Antony here with us this evening. We're going to have Antony talk for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we're going to open up the floor for a Q&A session after. So without further delay, I'll hand it over to you, Antony.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for that kind welcome, and thank you to the Sydney Democracy Network and the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney for hosting me here this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. So Hong Kong, City of Protest. This is a photo from the Umbrella Movement. It's also the photo from the cover of my book. The man in the centre does not have a penguin printed on his chest in real life. I didn't want to spend too much time tonight doing a sort of blow-by-blow examination of all the events of the Umbrella Movement. I think other things have happened since then that are worth examining in some detail as well. But I can't resist indulging in just a little bit of Umbrella Movement nostalgia before we move on, because it really was a remarkable time in Hong Kong history. It began with the occupation of the roads in Admiralty outside the government headquarters, prompted by tear gas and riot police who tried to prevent the protesters and led to even greater numbers of protesters coming out, and really unfolded into a 79-day occupation of the city streets. People settled in with tents. They really made themselves at home and then built all sorts of infrastructure around themselves to support the occupation. There were the famous supply stations. There was the homework zone, so that students who were protesting had a comfortable place in which to do their homework in the evening. There was art and culture. There was the Lenin Wall, where people left messages of support for the protesters. This is Umbrella Man, a monumental sculpture that was put up in the protest zone. There's other forms of rather more highfalutin art as well. There was religion of various denominations. And when the occupation was over and it sort of came to an end and the police finally cleared the protest sites out after the 79 days, it really left, I think, a lot of people who participated or observed it wondering, what did it all mean? Where did it come from? And where was it leading to, given that the protesters ultimately were not successful in their demands. And I, sort of having taken part in the protests and also having lived in Hong Kong for many years and so seen many other protests in the past, was also wondering what was it about Hong Kong that gave it such a strong culture of political protest. And the thing that really prompted me to sort of start looking at Hong Kong's history of protest was having spent a lot of time standing around scenes like this to sort of accidentally come across a historical photograph of Hong Kong police holding up a sign that says "Warning Tear Smoke," exactly the same kind of sign that they held up on that fateful day in September of 2014, and realising that this wasn't the first time that tear gas had been used on protesters in Hong Kong, or even the first time that there was a large-scale protest of this nature in Hong Kong, and it went all the way back to this era, which was the 1960s. And I'll talk a little bit more about the 1960s protests shortly. So all of that led me to sort of want to examine the history of political protest in Hong Kong and try to understand why is it that Hong Kong has such a strong culture of political protest. And sort of to summarise where I came out after sort of having spent some time thinking and writing about the subject, I think I identified what I think are really three key reasons why Hong Kong has such a strong culture of political protest. The first reason is that the way the Hong Kong political system is set up, structurally there are very few channels for people to meaningfully participate in the political protest. Hong Kong doesn't have a fully functioning representative democracy system. And this is by design. When Beijing was designing the post-handover political structure, they wanted to ensure that access to political power was very much controlled by Beijing. And so there are a number of structural things that they did to the Hong Kong political system to make sure of that. The first thing is that political power in Hong Kong is very much concentrated in the hands of the chief executive. The chief executive is sort of the post-handover governor, for want of a better word, and the head of the government. The chief executive appoints the cabinet, so all of the ministers and secretaries are appointed by the chief executive. He also appoints people really throughout different aspects of Hong Kong society, from the board of statutory bodies like the Securities and Futures Commission or the Independent Commission Against Corruption, to all the members of the governing boards of Hong Kong's public universities, to boards of arts organisations and other government bodies. So he has he has basically the sole power to make these key personnel appointments all the way across the Hong Kong government. In addition, the chief executive formulates government policy. His ministers her ministers, as it is at the moment, formulate the budget, and they also formulate legislation. So the political power is very much concentrated in the hands of the chief executive. The second step that Beijing took was to make sure that they controlled the selection process for the chief executive. So the chief executive is selected by a small circle committee of 1,200 member election committee, basically answerable to Beijing, comprised primarily of pro-Beijing business people. And so through that process, Beijing is able to ensure that their favoured candidate will always be selected as chief executive. And lastly, in terms of Hong Kong's legislature, the Legislative Council, Beijing ensured the system was rigged so that even though the pan-democratic parties always win a majority of the popular vote, they only get a minority of seats, and so are an eternal sort of opposition position. Sounds a little bit like some other democracies that we know, but this sort of ensures that the pan-dem parties will never be in a position to control the legislature, although they do have a super minority which enables them to veto certain legislation. The other interesting thing about the legislature in Hong Kong is that it cannot make policy in and of itself. All it can do, all legislation has to be passed by the Legislative Council in the same way that Parliament passes legislation here in Australia or in other democracies. But they cannot themselves formulate the bills that are going to be put to the LegCo. They are able to put so-called private members' bills, but these need a supermajority of separate majorities of effectively the pro-Beijing and the pan-democratic parties. So the only way that legislation is going to get to the floor of the Legislative Council and be passed is with the support of the government or with the support of the pro-Beijing parties. So structurally, the system is set up that people cannot have a vote or meaningfully have a voice in the political system. At the same time, I think people in Hong Kong generally recognise that the government, in particular the chief executive, serves very much at the pleasure of and makes their decisions at the behest of Beijing. But Hong Kong people do not have any direct means of communication, any direct channel of communication with Beijing. So all of this means that political protest is really an effective and meaningful way to participate in the political process. People are not able to vote, to have their representatives make a legislation running the government, but they can get out and protest. They can't directly communicate with Beijing, but they can take to the streets, and if they're in large enough numbers and they're noisy enough, then that will attract Beijing's attention. And indeed, sometimes it works, and this brings me to the second reason why protest is, I think, an important part of Hong Kong political culture. There have been times when political protest has been successful. The most notable was in 2003, when the government tried to introduce so-called Article 23 legislation. Now, Article 23 is a clause of the Basic Law, Hong Kong's constitution, which requires the Hong Kong government to implement anti-sedition legislation. Now, that law had never yet been implemented, it still hasn't been implemented, but in 2003 the government tried to introduce this legislation prohibiting sedition and the undermining of state power in Hong Kong. And it was drafted in very broad and draconian terms, and this prompted a huge protest. Up until that point, the largest protest that Hong Kong had seen. About 500,000 people took to the streets, all dressed in black. It was a very hot summer's day, but they were all dressed in black in symbolic mourning for Hong Kong, demanding that the legislation be withdrawn and demanding that Tung Chee-hwa, the chief executive at the time, resign. And the protest worked. In the wake of the protest, the Article 23 legislation was withdrawn. Regina Ip, who was the Secretary for Security, who had introduced the legislation, resigned. And a year later, after another slightly smaller but sort of similar scale protest on 1st of July 2004, Tung Chee-hwa himself resigned. So it was certainly a situation where mass public protest achieved its goal. Another example, and I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail later, is the national education curriculum. In 2012, the government was planning to introduce so-called moral and national education into Hong Kong's public school system, which was seen as effectively a brainwashing in terms of a very pro-Beijing curriculum. Students led by Joshua Wong and his scholarism group mobilized and protested against that proposal, and it was withdrawn. So to a certain extent, Hong Kongers have been conditioned that if they protest loudly enough and are effective in their protest, then they will be able to affect political change. And so I think that's the second reason that political protest is so prevalent in Hong Kong. The last reason is, I think, a deeper and perhaps the most important reason, and it has to do with Hong Kong identity. The right to protest, the right to freedom of speech, and the various other rights and freedoms that are enshrined in the Basic Law and grow out of really the common law legal system that Hong Kong inherited from the British, is an important part of what it means to be a Hong Konger, especially when distinguishing Hong Kong from the mainland, when Hong Kongers are trying to figure out what is their identity vis-a-vis the mainland China and their sovereign and sort of the rest of the world. And this was indirectly a result of the 1967 leftist riots. So just to give some background on that. In 1960s, the Cultural Revolution had begun in mainland China, obviously, began in 1966 and was to last for about 10 years. There was significant disturbances on the mainland China, and this eventually spread to Macau, to Hong Kong as well. In Hong Kong, it took the form first of workers' strikes, workers protesting against what were at the time quite deplorable labour conditions in Hong Kong. Workers had very few rights and protections under Hong Kong law at the time. And more broadly speaking, there was a great deal of problems in Hong Kong society. There was widespread poverty, inequality, there was little housing, poor education, very few social services, very little welfare programs. And so people were, I think, in significant degree of stress. And don't forget at the time that Hong Kong was also seeing significant migration from mainland China as people were sort of had fled both the Civil War, the Sino-Japanese War, and then the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution after that. So Hong Kong was becoming a very overcrowded and tense place, and there were a lot of people in quite dire straits. So encouraged by the Cultural Revolution, certainly prompted by certain pro-communist union leaders, and also coordinated by the Xinhua News Agency, which is sort of Beijing's unofficial representation at the time in Hong Kong. There were workers' strikes, which were then followed by widespread stop work sort of strikes across the territory, including strikes at the public transportation, the water and electricity companies, and so on. And eventually this devolved into rioting and also a campaign of terrorist bombing. It was a very unpleasant time in Hong Kong. Numerous people were killed by terrorist bombs, numerous people were killed in the course of rioting. Police obviously were injuring people as well, and police getting injured themselves. And it was really only when the terrorist bombing campaign led to the death of 2 young children who were playing outside their homes in North Point and accidentally set off a bomb that the tide of public opinion really turned against the protesters and turned against the striking workers. And the colonial government, appealing to notions of stability and prosperity, managed to bring the situation under control. Now, again, in the wake of those protests and those riots, the colonial government recognised the deep problems that were existing in Hong Kong society at the time and made a number of policy changes over the subsequent years. They introduced more social housing programs, they introduced compulsory education, free compulsory education for children. They introduced a new district officer system which would have people working at the local grassroots level, which would enable the colonial government to address the concerns of the local population, the local community. And so they took a number of measures which sort of arguably, in a way, again shows that this form of protest was effective in getting the colonial administration to address the concerns of the people of Hong Kong. But the other interesting thing that the colonial government did as part of their attempt to stabilise the situation was to try and encourage Hong Kongers to think of themselves as having a unique Hong Kong identity. Obviously this had political motivation. They were trying to avoid people identifying with Beijing and with the Cultural Revolution and with the pro-communist unions. And so the colonial government, I guess, rather cleverly said, Hong Kong is its own separate special space. They had various Hong Kong cultural weeks and Hong Kong cultural festivals that were introduced. And they started to take a number of very proactive steps to encourage a unique Hong Kong identity to develop. And that was really, many commentators have argued that late 60s, early 70s was the turning point where people stopped thinking of Hong Kong as a temporary place where they had fled from the mainland or fled from elsewhere to make a temporary home, and started to think of Hong Kong as home, and started to build an identity of Hong Kong as home around them. This developed over the subsequent decades, and then it really took on a new urgency after the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984, and in particular the 1989 Tiananmen protests. Hong Kongers, knowing that they were going to be handed back to the sovereignty of mainland China in 1997, were extremely alarmed by the crackdown on the protesters in 1989 in Beijing. This led to, again, very large protests in Hong Kong, and also led to Hong Kongers really coalescing around this idea of what came to be known as Hong Kong core values. And these were those values that I mentioned earlier, those rights and freedoms that Hong Kongers have enjoyed and that were enshrined in the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law. The right to protest, the right to freedom of speech, a free and unfettered press, clean government, the rule of law, independent judiciary. All of these things were sort of brought under the banner of Hong Kong core values. And it was both bottom-up and top-down. It was bottom-up in the sense that I think people in Hong Kong were very proud of these core values and felt that by exercising those core values, they were asserting their identity as Hong Kongers. And the government also sold these Hong Kong core values as the secret to Hong Kong's success. And that discourse about Hong Kong core values really continues all the way up until today. You'll still hear the Hong Kong government talking about Hong Kong core values when they're trying to sort of sell Hong Kong as a location for doing business. And then you will also see Hong Kong as decrying the threat to Hong Kong core values by various political developments. So it is really, I think, something that is important in the sense that Hong Kongers feel that by exercising the right to protest, they're exercising something that forms a part of Hong Kong identity. Protests and Hong Kong heritage and Hong Kong as a home and Hong Kong identity really grew hand in hand in the course of the 2000s. And there were a series of protests that were focused very much not on necessarily political issues, but so-called post-materialist issues of the environment and heritage and Hong Kong identity. So we had a series of protests when the government was going to tear down the old Star Ferry and Queen's Piers in Central. These were being torn down to make way for a large land reclamation program. And many people said that these are not only heritage buildings, they're also a key part of Hong Kong's collective memory. And so people were protesting to try and stop the demolition, ultimately unsuccessful, unfortunately. This was again seen in the so-called Wedding Card Street, which was a street in Wan Chai, an old tenement district, which was famous for having printing shops that printed colourful red and gold leaf wedding invitation cards. Again, the government, through its Urban Renewal Authority, decided that they're going to redevelop the area and they were going to tear down all the old buildings and forcefully buy out all of the residents of Wedding Card Street. And again, there were protests in terms of not just people wanting just compensation for the property that was being expropriated from them, but also people feeling that this Wedding Card Street had a unique identity and a unique community. And by tearing down the buildings and removing the people from that context, you were destroying the community and the social connections and very amorphous things, but people felt were important to Hong Kong's collective memory. And then again, the national education protest was another key protest I mentioned earlier. The government was seeking to introduce a so-called national education curriculum, which would contain some arguably quite biased and inaccurate information, and people saw this as brainwashing. It didn't help that the PRC liaison office officials basically said, yeah, brainwashing, it's brainwashing, but education is basically brainwashing anywhere in the world, isn't it? So it didn't inspire a great deal of confidence. But there was, again, huge protests, parents and children joining the protests, and ultimately the government withdrew the curriculum. But I think the important thing here was that, again, people felt that the Hong Kong core values were under threat, and that education and sort of the role of the youth in Hong Kong's future were things that people were very concerned not to have interfered with by the government. This series of protests in the 2000s, particularly the heritage and identity protests, also incidentally built the civil society networks and really gave the protesters the experience that would ultimately help them to successfully sort of lead the umbrella movement. Things like occupying the space outside the government offices was something that was done during the anti-national and moral education campaign. The heritage protesters from the Staff area in Queen's Pier and Wedding Card Street protests were some of the key leaders in sort of organising and marshalling the resources during the umbrella movement. So this sort of ongoing history of protests really culminated in the umbrella movement, and sort of it all built one upon the other. So really protest has become firmly entrenched in Hong Kong as a means of political expression and as an expression of Hong Kong identity. But Hong Kong is in a difficult place. It's in a unique position of what Chris Patton has called liberty without democracy. And there is, I think, nowhere else in the world quite like this. And just to explain what is meant by that, most places in the world, if you have those rights and freedoms such as the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of protest, etc., that's all often within the context of a broader representative democracy system. So indeed, you can protest and do all those things, but also invariably you're living in a place where you have elections, and you can also vote the government out and vote in your chosen representatives if you want to. On the other hand, places that do not enjoy those freedoms are also places that tend to have authoritarian governments which don't have representative democracy. So Hong Kong is interesting in that it has those rights and freedoms, but does not have the representative democracy system to go with it. And I would argue this sort of leads to a system that's sort of inherently in disequilibrium. And we're seeing pressures in both directions to try and right that. So from the protesters' side, and this was particularly the case in the umbrella movement, we're seeing pressures to try and increase the level of representative democracy to make that commensurate with the rights and freedoms that Hong Kongers enjoy. But at the same time, we're seeing from Beijing pressures to try and reduce the level of freedoms, to try and reduce the disequilibrium that way. And lately it seems, in particular in the wake of the umbrella movement, it seems that Beijing is probably winning that battle. And I'd like to sort of just go on now to sort of talk a little bit about what's happened since the umbrella movement in Hong Kong and sort of talk about where that might all be leading. I think it's quite clear now that Beijing is not going to tolerate Hong Kong being used as a base to subvert the party or subvert the mainland government or to undermine their interests. So I think it's very important for anyone in Hong Kong or observing Hong Kong to understand that the rights and freedoms and the so-called promises of a high degree of autonomy for Hong Kong need to be seen through that lens. And so, we've seen recently the bookseller abductions where publishers who were operating in Hong Kong, publishing books which were critical of the mainland government or gave salacious, thinly sourced stories about mainland leaders, and were selling these books into mainland China, often by postal order, were abducted across to the mainland and interrogated, and indeed one is still held there. This is clearly a message from Beijing saying, we're not going to tolerate you using Hong Kong as a base for carrying out what we see as subversive activity in the mainland. Similarly, Xiao Jianhua, a mainland businessman, was abducted from his hotel in Hong Kong, arguably for breaches of mainland law, but again, I think he was, the mainland is sort of seeing that they're quite comfortable to exercise the long arm of their jurisdiction into Hong Kong if it's seen as necessary by them to uphold state security and state power in mainland China. More recently, we've seen what I like to call a campaign of lawfare, that's L-A-W, lawfare, in Hong Kong. This is the government, the Hong Kong government, and sort of backed by Beijing, using Hong Kong's legal system and Hong Kong's rule of law to achieve political ends and to operate against the pan-democratic parties and democratic activists in Hong Kong. This began, I think, with the so-called Occupy injunctions. So when the Occupy umbrella movement protests were ending, the government did not choose to clear the protests by taking police action. The protests were illegal under Hong Kong law. Under Hong Kong law, if you don't have permission from the Commissioner of Police to hold a public gathering or public march, then the gathering is an unlawful assembly, and you're committing a crime, and the police can come in and arrest you and clear the protest area. So from day 2 or 3 after the police had said we're not going to continue approving your protest, the umbrella movement was an illegal, unlawful assembly and could have been cleared by the police at any time. But the government didn't do that. The government let them stay there. And ultimately, the way that the umbrella movement protests were brought to an end was that various civil actors, so minibus companies, taxi companies, people who argued that their business was being affected by the umbrella movement occupation, went to the civil courts in Hong Kong and applied for an injunction. And got an injunction order from the courts requiring that the protest areas be cleared. Now, what this enabled the government to do was to then clear the protesters by appealing to notions of the rule of law, basically saying, the courts have ruled, rule of law is a core Hong Kong value, it's very important for us to uphold the rule of law, and so we're therefore going to go ahead and clear the protest sites. It enabled them to avoid making the difficult political decision of saying, we're going to just go ahead and clear this because that's the decision we're going to make. They pushed the role of doing that back onto the courts and onto the civil court process. And I would argue that's an example of what we refer to as not rule of law, but rule by law. That is, using the legal system to achieve political aims. And I think that was really the beginning of this campaign of lawfare that Hong Kong is seeing. I think, the Hong Kong government and Beijing have very cleverly realised that this is a way to legitimise whatever actions they might take and be able to appeal to Hong Kong core values and appeal to the notion of upholding the rule of law, which would justify their actions not only in the eyes of the broader Hong Kong community, but also the international community who may be observing. The next thing we saw were the Legislative Council elections in last year in November. Even prior to the election being held, the Electoral Commission effectively engaged in screening the candidates. This was because there were a number of political parties that had sprung up in the aftermath of the umbrella movement who were advocating various forms of self-determination from Hong Kong, or localism or nativism. They ran sort of the gamut from just parties that were arguing for more autonomy for Hong Kong, all the way through to certain parties that are arguing for full independence for Hong Kong. And the government wanted to avoid enabling these actors to participate in the political protest. So what they did was that they required candidates for the election to sign a declaration saying that they agreed to uphold the clause of the Basic Law that said that Hong Kong is an inalienable part of China, and effectively making sure they weren't going to advocate any form of self-determination or independence for Hong Kong. So some of those candidates refused to sign the form and were barred from running. Other pro-democracy candidates who also refused to sign the form but were from more establishment parties such as the Civic Party were allowed to stand. And then just to top it all off, there was one localist candidate who did sign the form, but then the Electoral Commission argued they didn't think he was sincere and they didn't believe his declaration, so he was disqualified anyway. So effectively, the Electoral Commission has decided these candidates are not allowed to stand and these candidates are allowed to stand. Now, arguably, already at that point, when you have unelected officials screening out candidates from an election, you no longer have a properly functioning democracy. In any event, despite the disqualifications, so-called pro-localist candidates won 6 seats in the 70-seat legislature and got nearly 20% of the vote. So it really shows that there's a significant support in the Hong Kong community for these people and some of the views that they're expressing. Now, things devolved even further with the so-called oath-swearing fiasco that ensued. So when the new legislature was going to be sworn in late last year, it's been somewhat of a tradition in Hong Kong that the pan-democrat parties, particularly the more extreme of the pan-democratic parties, such as the League of Social Democrats and Civic Passion, engage in all kinds of theatrics inside the Legislative Council chamber. I think that they've always seen, those pan-democratic politicians have always seen protest as an important part of their role as politicians, particularly in a situation where they are eternally in the opposition and really only in a position to object or speak out against government policy and not to implement their own policies. They've seen leading protest as a key part of their political role, and many of the leading pan-dem politicians were at the front lines of the umbrella movement, coordinating things, helping the students and all those sorts of engaging in those kind of activities. And they do it inside the chamber as well. So they've thrown bunches of bananas at Donald Tsang and thrown long hair through bitter melon at the financial secretary to try and illustrate the bitter conditions of the working class and these sorts of things. So traditionally, whenever they have the swearing-in ceremony, some of these pan-dem politicians have engaged in some degree of theatrics before or after they've sworn their oath of office. In the situation last year, the two candidates from the Youngspiration Party, who were arguably among the more extreme of the localist parties, deliberately misread their oaths to sort of include obscenities or to mispronounce the word China. Badgio Leung prominently crossed his fingers when he was saying his oath, which is, it was frankly kind of juvenile theatrics and not the smartest thing to do in the context of taking an oath of office. But arguably it was of a piece with the other things that legislators have done in the past at this time. The government then launched a judicial review of their actions, and the National People's Congress in Beijing issued an interpretation of the Basic Law even before the court could rule on the judicial review of Badgio Leung and Yao Wei-ching's oath-swearing antics. And what the National People's Congress in Beijing said was that this oath of office that the legislators in Hong Kong take must be taken solemnly and sincerely. You only have one chance. If you muck it up, then you can't take it again. And if there's any indication that you're not doing it solemnly or sincerely, then you're going to be immediately disqualified. So the court applied that ruling from Beijing and then immediately disqualified the two Youngspiration legislators. And emboldened by that, the government went back and then tried to seek the disqualification of 4 additional legislators. And so Long Hair Leung, one of the more famous of the extreme League of Social Democrats legislators, Nathan Law, who was one of the umbrella movement leaders who was elected, and 2 other legislators, had all engaged in various degrees of theatrics around their oath swearing, not as extreme as the 2 Youngspiration leaders, but certainly not, arguably not solemn and sincere in the way that Beijing was arguing they should be. And so the court, again, applying that interpretation from Beijing, disqualified those 4 legislators. So we now have a situation where 6 out of 70 legislators who were duly elected by the people of Hong Kong have been dismissed from office by action of the government under cover of the courts, using the court system and the rule of law as cover for them, effectively kicking out 6 legislators they didn't like. More than that, they have required the legislators who have been kicked out of office to repay all the salaries and emoluments and benefits they've been paid in the short period that they were in office, which will lead many of them to be forced to declare personal bankruptcy as well. On top of that, they've got the legal costs that they've spent in the court cases, and because Hong Kong has a loser pays court system like we have here in Australia, they'll be liable to pay the court costs and the legal fees of the government as well. So these 6 legislators are going to be not only kicked out of office, but also effectively bankrupted, and potentially also excluded from the political protest in future if they are undischarged bankrupts. The next stage in the campaign of lawfare was the sentencing review of Joshua Wong and 2 other of the campaigners. So at the beginning of the Umbrella Movement, Joshua Wong and 2 other of the student leaders occupied Civic Square, which was a square outside the government headquarters that they leapt the fence and sort of led an occupation of that square. Initially they were charged with unlawful assembly. They were given a community service order which they served, everything was fine. But the government decided they weren't happy with the sentence, so the government appealed the sentence, arguing that they should have had a heavier sentence than just community service. And ultimately, the court agreed with the government and imposed jail terms of 7 to 9 months for each of the three activists. What that means is because they've been given jail terms of more than 6 months, they're therefore also not permitted to run for office for the next 5 years. So not only has the government given them a heavier punishment for the crime they committed of engaging in this act of protest, but they've also been able to then exclude these top student leaders, including Joshua Wong, from the political protest for the next 5 years, which means they won't be able to run effectively for another election until 10 years from now. So that is sort of just, again, the next step in this ongoing campaign of using the court systems and using the law to slowly chip away at the pro-democrat legislators and the pro-democrat activists. There's been a lot of debate in Hong Kong also around the so-called Hong Kong independence activists. Now, I'm not going to discuss the merits of Hong Kong independence at all. I mean, frankly, it's neither a realistic nor a sensible aim to sort of campaign for. But notwithstanding that, Hong Kong enjoys freedom of speech, and if people want to talk about Hong Kong independence, write about it, whatever, there should be no reason why they can't. That's part of having the rights and freedoms that Hong Kong has. But the government has taken the position that even talking about independence for Hong Kong is illegal, because the basic law provides that Hong Kong is a part of China, and therefore even to talk about the notion that Hong Kong is not a part of China is a breach of the basic law and therefore illegal in Hong Kong. And that has led to things like localist activists being unable to register companies or open bank accounts for their political organisations, election materials being censored by the Electoral Commission because they include references to things like self-determination, which are alleged to be illegal. And this has then devolved to things like a poster campaign on the university campuses in Hong Kong, where you have some campaigners putting up posters, kind of a classic poster war saying Hong Kong independence, and then others tearing them down, and then sort of a lot of unfortunate sort of public discourse and arguments around this. Now, part of the problem is that certainly the government is trying to argue that talking about Hong Kong independence or talking about self-determination for Hong Kong is illegal, but there's currently no law saying that in Hong Kong. But there is certainly a mechanism that could be introduced, and that is the so-called Article 23 law. This is the law that you'll recall was withdrawn after the massive protests of 2003. But I think in the wake of the Umbrella Movement, in the wake of the increasing success of the nativist or localist parties in the elections, and this sort of increasing discussion of Hong Kong independence and self-determination in public discourse, the Mainland government is going to be very keen to try and introduce that law. And I would not be surprised if Carrie Lam at some point during her administration is required by Beijing to do that. And that's going to be an important touchstone to see where Hong Kong is really at, to see what kind of a reaction that gets. Will that get a similar outpouring of protests that we got in 2003, or will people sort of realise that we have to live with it? It was very clear from Xi Jinping's speech when he spoke in Hong Kong on the 1st of July to mark the 20th anniversary of the handover, that there was in the minds of Beijing a very clear red line that shouldn't be crossed. She said that any attempt to endanger national sovereignty and security, challenge the power of the central government and the authority of the basic law of the HKSAR, or use Hong Kong to carry out infiltration and sabotage activities against the mainland is an act that crosses the red line and is absolutely impermissible. And the question really, I think, for Hong Kong is, where is that red line going to be drawn? Obviously, it includes things like producing and disseminating books that undermine party leaders. It obviously also seems to include advocating for independence for Hong Kong. That also extends to anything about self-determination for Hong Kong, which Hong Kong sees as a backdoor, which Beijing sees as a backdoor to independence. But if you keep inching your way along this spectrum, then eventually you're going to perhaps quite quickly reach the point where even criticising the Hong Kong government itself is seen as a way of indirectly undermining national interests and national security and sovereignty, and so has already crossed the red line. And once you reach the point where you're no longer even allowed to criticise the government, perhaps no longer allowed to protest against the government, then all of those rights and freedoms upon which Hong Kong is built are very quickly going to disappear. I think the challenge for Hong Kong is that Hong Kong's competitive advantage vis-a-vis really not only mainland China but much of the rest of Asia is trust. In Hong Kong, unlike much of the rest of China and the rest of Asia, you trust that you'll have a fair hearing before the courts. You trust that your government officials will not be on the take. You trust that government agencies treat everyone fairly and impartially. You trust that your food is hygienic. You trust that your milk powder is safe for your children. You trust that the medicines sold in your pharmacies are not fake. This trust is really what underlines the success of Hong Kong and underlines what makes people willing to live in and do business in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong really needs to keep fighting to maintain this trust. But with every step that Beijing takes, whether it's through its campaign of lawfare or otherwise, to tighten its control over Hong Kong, that trust gets slightly eroded. And it's a very careful balancing act that I think Beijing and the Hong Kong government need to manage if they're going to try and want to increase their control over Hong Kong without undermining that trust that really builds Hong Kong's success. Now, all of this is sort of a little bit, perhaps a little bit pessimistic for the future of Hong Kong. But on the other hand, Hong Kong at the moment is a contested space. It was a contested space really in the course of the umbrella movement, and it's still a contested space. And contested spaces are interesting spaces. There has been really something of a cultural renaissance since the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. There's been large amounts of interesting art being made by Hong Kong artists, people like Samson Young and Casey Wong. An outburst of independent cinema, both documentaries and small indie films being made by Hong Kong filmmakers. Often they're unable to find places to screen them because cinemas are not willing to screen them, even though people want to watch them, because they're worried about government, what views the government might have of that. But certainly there is a lively cultural life within this contested space of Hong Kong. And the Hong Kong youth are really increasingly engaged in politics and their community. The umbrella movement made it very clear that whatever previous misconceptions people might have had about young people in Hong Kong not caring about politics or not caring about their home, I think the umbrella movement and everything that's followed in subsequent years has shown that they really care deeply about their home and they're willing to very actively take steps to be engaged in politics and engaged in their community and to fight for that. And that really gives me a great deal of hope. But I think the important message, and I think the message I want to leave with all of you today, is that they need our help. It's really incumbent on all of us who have an interest in Hong Kong, who care about Hong Kong and who care about its future, to keep watching, to keep caring, to speak out when we see things that we need to speak out against, and to fight against the creeping erosion of Hong Kong core values that may undermine Hong Kong's future. But I think if all of us care and pay that attention, then Hong Kong will have a bright future. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Antony. That was terrific. I think we're going to start with the Q&A session now. So I believe we're going to have a roaming mic, correct? Yep. All right. So we're going to have about similar amount of time for the Q&A. If you could just briefly state your name and introduce yourself and keep your questions brief, that'd be great. So whoever wants to go first.
Thank you very much. My name is Salman, and I thank you for this informative talk. Thank you very much for that. I've got a question for you, but before that, I want to say that a friend of mine who is of my age, and he was born in Hong Kong, he has a family there in Hong Kong, and he told me that a substantial percentage of people in Hong Kong are against having tension with mainland China. And that these protests are seen as seeking identity. But this identity, as you kindly offer, was dictated by the colonial past. However, history goes much further. And what he said that is that Hong Kong, for Chinese historians, has a deep and very painful history, which it was intended actually previously as a gate for harming the nation. And then he said that there are 56 local identities, 56 Hong Kongs in China, and they are all watching various forces within society there, watching what is happening in Hong Kong. So the issue is much deeper, and the perspectives vary greatly. My question is the following. Is it possible for objective observers to offer perspectives based on cooperation, interconnectedness, mutual benefit, and flexibility, rather than accenting tension and social division? Thank you.
No, you're quite right. People don't like to be in tension or in conflict with the mainland, and I think that Hong Kong both recognises its economic reliance on the mainland, and I think the majority of Hong Kongers are quite happy with Hong Kong being part of China and quite happy with their identity as both Chinese and Hong Kongers. And there have been extensive opinion polls led by the University of Hong Kong asking people how they regard their self-identity, and people agree that they feel Chinese, but they also feel Hong Kongers, and they want to maintain those two dual identities hand in hand. I feel that what people are asking for when they're protesting in Hong Kong is not necessarily not that they're fighting against the mainland or fighting against Beijing, or that they're asking for anything really much more than what they were promised at the time of the handover, which was Hong Kongers would be allowed to run Hong Kong without interference. There's a very clear rule in the Basic Law that says mainland officials are not allowed to participate or interfere in the electoral process in Hong Kong, but it's an open secret that the liaison office of Beijing in Hong Kong actively helps the pro-Beijing parties in the elections, both through logistics and coordination and funding and those sorts of things. That's a breach of the Basic Law. There's I think a sense that if Hong Kong is given what they were led to believe they were going to be getting, then there'd be much less tension with the mainland. But I do agree that people do want to get along. They do want the mainland to work with Hong Kong, hand in hand for everyone's mutual benefit and success. I think the feeling is that this language of mutual benefit is often used to disguise a situation which is really to only one side's benefit and not the other. But I should also observe that just the international law and international custom has moved a long way since 1984. International law is a very amorphous and developing area, but we have things now, for example, like the responsibility to protect, which would allow countries to step into other countries if there are certain ethnic minorities that are suffering from genocide, these sorts of things. And one of those developing areas is the right to self-determination. And in the years since the Basic Law, the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed in 1984, there have been numerous new countries established. Czechoslovakia divided into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. There's Kosovo. There's South Sudan. There are many other countries. And what I wonder is if 1984 was happening now instead of back then, would the Hong Kong people have their fate forced upon them without any right to have a say in the process? Even just last week we had referendums for the Kurds and for Catalonia. People in Hong Kong were watching those very closely and sort of wondering what is it that they missed out on? So I'm not saying that means that people in Hong Kong necessarily want self-determination or independence or any of those things, but they want a right to be heard, I think, and which is something I think they feel is something that they're not getting, which is perhaps what prompts many of the protests. But thank you for your question.
I don't need the mics again. Antony, thanks very much for your talk. My name is Toy. So I live in Hong Kong as well. So I live in Hong Kong as well. So I guess the.
Let's start again. Anthony, thank you for your talk. My name is Toy. I live in Hong Kong as well. So I'm on holidays and saw that you were speaking about your book. So I thought I'd stop by and grill you with a couple of questions. So
Thank you.
Look, one question I have for you, it's sort of a question and sort of a comment. You've spoken a lot, obviously, about the various politics-related aspects of Hong Kong's recent history. For someone living in Hong Kong, I think one of the things that certainly my friends, when they ask me about what's happening in Hong Kong, what they don't necessarily appreciate is that the young people of Hong Kong society seems to have not a whole lot of hope about Hong Kong's future. And that's partly for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. I think it's also some of it to do with economics, and specifically, I find a lot of the younger generation of Hong Kong have no hope in terms of having a property, building a family with a decent income, being able to provide for their parents, provide for their kids, get their kids a good education at a reasonable price. A lot of these things are taken for granted in Australia and elsewhere, and so in Hong Kong it's lacking that a little bit. And some of that has to do with the factors you mentioned, some of that has to do with other factors. I was hoping you could comment a little bit on that.
No, totally agree. Yeah, totally agree. There's a strong economic aspect to all of this. I would argue that's also in a way tied back to the politics in this way, that effectively Beijing and the property tycoons have stitched up control of Hong Kong. So between the tycoons that run the real estate companies that make Hong Kong go round, are sort of very close to Beijing, and so they work to run Beijing together. The government relies on revenue from property developers to fund its budget, because Hong Kong has a very low tax base, but from premiums from land sales is really, and stamp duty from land transactions is really what funds the Hong Kong government. And all of this is structurally built into the basic law and built into the political system. To do the things that would enable Hong Kong's economic position to improve, like lowering housing prices, like giving more opportunities to people, for example, to start entrepreneurial small businesses, which they can't do because the price of property is too high to be able to open a little store or open a little business or what have you. You need to change the control of the property tycoons and change that part of the basic law that mandates that we have to have a low tax system and we have to sort of run Hong Kong's political economy in this way. And so, unfortunately, the vested interests are such that property prices are never really going to fall too far, and the tycoons will always be in control. And I think young people see that and feel a little bit of hopelessness. How do we fix that? I hope that the government has policies and programs that they might implement to do that. I know a lot of young Hong Kong people are talking about emigrating. It's sort of a second wave of emigration, the first of which was really pre-97, when many people came from Hong Kong to Australia, to Canada, to the UK, worried about what would happen after 1997. Many of those people went back after 97 because they saw that everything was actually fine and the roof didn't fall in and the mainland wasn't interfering too much in Hong Kong. But 20 years after the handover, this younger generation are feeling increasingly hopeless and are talking about emigrating. And interestingly, they're not now talking about emigrating to Canada, Australia or the US. A lot of them are talking about emigrating to Taiwan, which they see as an example of a culturally Chinese representative democracy with rights and freedoms, but also a sense of a cultural home where they can feel comfortable in. And so I think that's also quite an interesting development. How much of it is is real versus anecdotal. I'm not sure. I guess we'll see as time goes on. But certainly, yeah, it's the economy just as much as the political situation that has led young people to be feeling a sense of hopelessness. I agree.
I've got one up here.
Thank you for the microphone. Hi, Professor. I'm
not a professor. I just play one on television.
I'm a senior university student and also nearly attended the Hong Kong University 1 year ago. As for the identity, and I think Hong Kong is kind of like a divided city because like some of the citizens have those Hong Kong identity, and some of them have Chinese and Hong Kong identity, and some of them have British identity or as a global citizen. So how do you think that Hong Kongers can balance between their internal identity dilemma and their like external forces from the CCP, and how can they like balance them and find a way out like to achieve their goals? Maybe like self-determination, or maybe not. Like I'm just quite confused.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I feel that's really been one of Hong Kong's strengths, that so many different people can feel at home there, whether you are born and grew up in Hong Kong, whether you've come to Hong Kong from the mainland when you were a child or when you were an adult, whether you've come to Hong Kong, as I did, as an adult from overseas. People can come from really anywhere and find a place for themselves and find an identity that works in Hong Kong. And it's really, I think, something that makes it quite unique. There's not many places in the world where you have such a diversity among the community and such a diversity of identities. And I think it would be a pity if that was homogenized. If the aim was, and maybe this is the aim, that over time immigration from mainland China to Hong Kong will be to such a great extent that similar to Xinjiang or Tibet, it will be sinified, and much of that diversity will be sort of eventually bred out of Hong Kong, and it will homogenize and sort of fit into the rest of China quite neatly. That would be a great loss for Hong Kong, I think, and would really undermine a lot of its success. So hopefully leaders have the wisdom to see that these identities can coexist peacefully and equally contribute to making Hong Kong the place that it is. So yeah, hopefully we don't have to resolve and get rid of all these different identities, but keep them all.
I've got one more there. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you for your lecture. When you mentioned,
Your name?
my name is Bing Chao from this university. When you mentioned the reason for there are so many people out street to protest in Hong Kong is Hong Kong has not a truly functioning democracy or very fully representative democracy. But I think China has ruled Hong Kong just for 30 years, and for the rest of history, particularly Hong Kong history, it is colonial history from Britain. And if democracy is really good, why British government, especially British Parliament, just let Hong Kong go to give them fully represented government, rather than they appoint a member of Parliament to become a governor of Hong Kong? So if democracy is good, why Britain didn't and never implement democracy in Hong Kong in the history?
Okay, 2 points. Firstly, that's not true. In the 1960s and 70s, Britain tried to introduce democracy and was told by Beijing that if they did, China would invade. That's been revealed in Foreign Office documents that have since been unearthed in recent years. Secondly, Chris Patten did introduce more democracy in the 1990s. Chris Patten introduced a number of democratic reforms, and as soon on midnight on the 30th of June 1997, the provisional legislature appointed by Beijing undid all of those laws and took them back again, and so took Hong Kong's situation back and undid some of the democratic reforms that Chris Patten introduced. So my first point is that that's just not accurate. But my second point is, so what? Life moves on. Places change. Societies have to develop and change. I think one of the most pernicious things about the Basic Law is the promise of 50 years no change. This people somehow drawing comfort from this thing that the Basic Law says, oh, don't worry, nothing's going to change in Hong Kong for 50 years. And I just sort of wonder, how can that possibly be a good thing, that nothing in a society changes for 50 years? Societies change, technology moves on, the world moves on. Societies have to adapt and evolve and develop. And if you're saying this place has to be kept in aspect and not changed in any way for 50 years, that can't be healthy for the development of that society and that polity. So, even if for whatever reason Hong Kong didn't have whatever system in the past, that's not an argument for why it shouldn't have it now. It needs to be argued on its merits. And maybe the answer is it's not appropriate, but the argument for that isn't, well, they never did, so they don't deserve it now. That's my view.
Okay, thank you.
There's a question up there.
Thank you for the lecture. And my name is Lancer, and I'm currently studying the political science and international relationships in this university. And I've read a book before, and it was written by a Dutch writer called Ian Bruma, and it was published in 1991. The name is A Great World City, Hong Kong, and in which he gave some very aspiring sentences. I quote here: "This city will no longer tolerate its current status of merely being an economic center. Rather, it is, and it will continually seeking a new identity of becoming a citizen, since they were used to be the subject of the British colonial era. And there's a very interesting phenomenon that under the British governance, that it was only until 1995 that for the first time the Hong Kong citizens had their rights to directly elect their legislation, their Department of Legislation, and currently it is obvious that, as you mentioned, that the chief executive officer was not directly by the people. It was elected. It was nominated and elected within a small circle. That's so. Is it kind of the failure of what we call the state building, or the failure of the transition of the identity, or to a certain extent, do you think this is a failure or dysfunction of what we call the one country, two systems ideology?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's an interesting point. I would agree there has been a failure of state building. I wouldn't necessarily say that means it's a failure of one country, two systems. And I think they're perhaps separate things. I think one interesting observation to make in the context of everything you were just discussing is that Hong Kong never really went through a decolonization process like many other former colonies did. Most former colonies went through a process of decolonization, of some form of, the colonial power left and the local populace sort of took over ruling of their own place, and so went through that process. Hong Kong never really went through a proper decolonization process. So because of that, there wasn't that state building process that you refer to. Perhaps it's a little bit oversimplistic to say they just substituted sort of one colonial master for the other and remain a colony. And certainly there is that sense among some people in Hong Kong, they still feel like a colony. But I think you're quite right. It's sort of a failure to build the institutions perhaps that would enable it to perhaps function more maturely. I still believe in one country, two systems. I think one country, two systems can work. It depends upon everyone agreeing with the premise that, Hong Kong people rule Hong Kong and Beijing doesn't interfere. But, for an authoritarian government, it's kind of hard to resist to just want to tweak a little bit here and tweak a little bit there. So, yeah. But I think one country, two systems can still work if everyone believes in it and tries to uphold it, certainly.
One more?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthony. I am Zila and I'm from China. I'm doing my Master of International Studies. And my question is, what do you think Hong Kong as the status of economy? Because since the 1980s, Hong Kong seen as the Pearl of Orient, and people very appreciate Hong Kong, and a lot of beautiful words to sing with Hong Kong. But now, with the booming prosperity along with another city like Shenzhen and Shanghai, do you think the economy shift to Shenzhen or Shanghai, and that makes Hong Kong a little bit lower in economy? And is Hong Kong still a center of finance in the world? And what do you think about it? Thank you.
No, it's a good question. Perhaps a little bit of historical context would be helpful. So, Hong Kong's economy really started to boom in the 60s, in particular in the 70s, as a manufacturing centre. And this was before China had opened to the outside world and before much of the rest of Asia was developed. Hong Kong had factories churning out toys and plastic flowers, was how Li Ka-shing got his start. Light industrial goods, clothing, all sorts of things. If you think back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, if you looked at the labels on your products, many of them would have said made in Hong Kong. After the mainland opened up and began to develop, much of that manufacturing shifted across the border to Shenzhen, the Guangdong province, where it was much cheaper to manufacture. And Hong Kong became the trading port, and so all the goods were manufactured by often Hong Kong-owned factories across the border in Shenzhen and Guangdong, and then shipped out through Hong Kong, and so Hong Kong was sort of a trading entrepot. As China opened more, Hong Kong was also sort of the platform into China for foreign investors, so people would use Hong Kong as a way to access the mainland Chinese market in the early stages of China opening up to the outside world and developing. But things changed in particular after China joined the WTO in 2001. The Chinese economy developed, places, as you say, like Shenzhen and Shanghai became increasingly sophisticated. The Shenzhen and Shanghai ports eclipsed Hong Kong in terms of trading throughput, as people were happy to ship directly from Shenzhen and Shanghai. They didn't need to go through Hong Kong as a trading entrepreneur anymore. Foreign businesses got more comfortable dealing directly into mainland China. They didn't need to use Hong Kong as a stepping stone into mainland China anymore. They were comfortable. Often they had localized their management, so the management of the foreign companies were Chinese anyway, operating at home. They were comfortable using Chinese law firms, Chinese accountants, and all those sorts of intermediaries. So Hong Kong sort of lost its role as a stepping stone into China, but at the same time it found itself as a stepping stone out of China, as many of the Chinese companies found that Hong Kong was a convenient place both to keep foreign exchange, because Hong Kong has a freely convertible currency and an open capital account. Money can be remitted in and out of Hong Kong freely, which it still cannot in the mainland. And a relatively open and reliable legal system that enabled them to set up companies that could then be used as vehicles for carrying out capital raising overseas or acquisitions overseas and those sorts of things. So Hong Kong has continued to have this role as a stepping stone out of China for these so-called window companies, also for the big SOEs and Chinese companies. The problem is that I think Hong Kong is again facing a sort of a moment of truth in that China has become so sophisticated in terms of technology, things like AI and robotics and the internet and all those things. China is arguably leading the world, and Hong Kong doesn't really have a role in that. They're trying to create a role in that by sort of setting up a tech park on the border with Shenzhen where they're going to sort of have some high-tech industries. And the one thing that Hong Kong does have that the mainland doesn't have is a free and open internet. And arguably in this era, that's a significant competitive advantage. I think Stephanie can speak to that in detail. The moment that the RMB becomes fully convertible and the capital account opens up in China, then suddenly Hong Kong loses one of its last key competitive advantages. So you're quite right that Hong Kong needs to think about where its economy is going and what's going to be the next step. And it may be related to the competitive advantage that having a free and open internet means for tech companies and those sorts of things. It may be that whole issue of trust that I talked about earlier and being able to leverage that trust to some benefit in terms of business. If not, then there is a significant risk that Hong Kong becomes that sort of, that thing that everyone often talks about, just another Chinese city on the coast that sort of, perhaps absorbed into Shenzhen and Guangzhou into kind of a greater Pearl River Delta area. Hong Kong's still, I think, a nice place for the mainland Chinese elites to want to come and live. They like to buy apartments there and send their kids to school there and those sorts of things. But it may find its economic importance eclipsing even further if they don't think of a way to I agree, to lead onwards into the future. So yeah, it's a significant risk.
We have one more over here, and then another one there.
Thank you. My question is following on the Hong Kong identity.
Your name?
My name is Tom. I'm from Mainland. You said that the people from it's good thing for people with virus that they need to feel at home in Hong Kong. But you think that there's indeed there's a tension between these identities. And I was told by my friend of Hong Kong that the fact is that the younger generation are more easily and likely to feel that it's okay to view themselves as pure Hong Kongers, and while the older generations are more likely to feel that this identity of Hong Kongers is originated from the identity of Chinese. So I guess there's a problem for the older generation is that this independence and high level of self-determination movement will likely to break the relationship between them and within themselves and their identity of Chinese. So I think they also definitely would like to protect the democracy. So can this protection of democracy be done in a different way rather than has to achieve a high level of self-determination? Thank you.
Yeah, I certainly think it can, and it probably should, but whether that will stop people talking about it, I'm not sure. And I think I've got two observations, really. Firstly is, before the umbrella movement, no one talked about Hong Kong independence or self-determination. There was no such thing as a Hong Kong localist movement. It was entirely a product of the way the government reacted to and handled the umbrella movement protests. I think a lot of the young people who really formed the core of that protest movement felt that they were ignored, they weren't listened to, their demands weren't considered, and they were, I think, probably felt pushed into it. That, well, if you're not going to, let us participate and meaningfully engage, then we're going to go even more extreme and ask for, self-determination. That's sort of my first observation. This situation was created by the Hong Kong government and the Beijing government. It wasn't sort of spontaneous. My second observation is that you're very right to point out that generation gap between younger and older Hong Kongers. And I've heard that Casey Wong, in fact, a Hong Kong artist who does a lot of protest-themed art, has said what he says is what we're seeing in Hong Kong at the moment is a generational war disguised as a political war. He says, in the end, this is not really about, in his view, about politics. It's about a generation gap and about, perhaps what Hoy mentioned earlier, that a younger generation feeling disillusioned and without hope and opportunity, and an older generation who are very comfortable having made their living and built their success off business relationships with mainland China and all those things. So it's that generation gap which it may lead to more extreme positions being taken than are sensible, but hopefully it's all part of a debate which ends up with some kind of compromise where people can feel they can find a space where all the different interests are accommodated. But that's politics, right? The art of compromise, the art of the possible. So, yeah. Cindy, did you have a question?
So my name is Cindy. I'm a student at UTS School of Journalism. I know you, Antony, also dabble in journalism sometimes, and my question for you is that in this political climate and ever restricting press freedoms, not just directly but indirectly, some sort of self-censorship, how can we protect freedom of the press and by extension freedom of speech in Hong Kong, especially since the recent attacks on journalists and also kidnapping of booksellers, as you mentioned. So I used to want to be a foreign correspondent in Hong Kong, but now I'm not so sure.
You're concerned for your personal safety. I think one of the biggest certainly there is all those things you mentioned. I think that the kidnapping and the attacks on journalists are quite rare. Certainly they've happened, and it's terrible that they have. They're still quite rare. The bigger threat to press freedom in Hong Kong is to do with commercial pressures and media ownership. So the Beijing government directly and indirectly owns the largest book publishing company in Hong Kong and most of the retail book companies. They own 3 of the largest newspapers in Hong Kong. Pro-democracy minded newspapers like the Apple Daily have often seen pressure on their advertisers to pull their advertising from those magazines or newspapers. Direct or indirect political pressure being led to bear, which leaves obviously those companies lacking the funding to operate. So things like commercial pressure on advertisers, ownership, and all those things affecting the diversity of the media in Hong Kong is one of the biggest threats to press freedom. Same in Australia. The other aspect, which also is a concern, is self-censorship. Samson Wong, one of the Hong Kong artists, sort of puts it well when he says, things that weren't sensitive 2 days ago become sensitive yesterday, and things that weren't sensitive yesterday have become sensitive today. And there's this never-ending sense that there's more and more things that are sensitive. No one really knows why. There's no sort of direct instruction. People just sort of start to get a feeling that maybe we shouldn't talk about this, maybe we shouldn't show that film, maybe we shouldn't publish this article. Certainly in relation to my own book, there's the subject matter I don't think is that controversial, and if you read it, which I hope you all will, it's not pushing any particular political line. It's quite historical and quite factual analysis, but notwithstanding that, the subject matter has led some booksellers in Hong Kong to be reluctant to stock it. I've been asked to invited to talk about the book, but then told, can you please not talk about the book when you talk? So, there's, and certainly, there's sort of been issues around that as well. So, but all of that is self-imposed. That's, I think, one of the tragedies of Hong Kong is that, at least until recent years, so much of these erosions of freedoms and things that have happened have been self-imposed, have been imposed by people doing what they think is expected of them, or doing what they think will please Beijing or please Chinese commercial interests or whatever, rather than it being directly dictated or told what to do. So it's a very long way of saying it. Certainly press freedom is under threat, but there is still a lively free press in Hong Kong, and I'm sure more voices like your own are very welcome to contribute to it. So don't be afraid.
That was basically my question. It was on press freedom. I was a journalism student here.
Right.
Your name? Jamie. Hi. Perhaps my question would be: do you think the idea of a free press is enshrined within the core values of Hong Kong? Because it's the hallmark of any modern democratic society. Do they perhaps my parents are from Hong Kong, so their perception is that there's a very general mistrust, whether it's between amongst the middle class or the lower class, towards newspapers, and I think you've already touched on that. But if there is not the idea of my perception is, if they don't have the idea of, God knows we don't like a lot of our mainstream newspapers, but we respect their identity. If there is not that core value there, how does it move forward, and what is your vision of the future for the press at all?
Yeah, it's certainly part of Hong Kong core values. And Hong Kong has had a history of having a very lively press. A lot of it focused on celebrity gossip and car crash photos and things like that, but a lot of it also focused on more important issues like politics. The papers in Hong Kong tend to take pretty strong political lines. So the pro-Beijing papers will take a very strong pro-Beijing stance. They've been known to lead campaigns against, for example, against Johannes Chan, the Hong Kong U academic, who former Dean of Law, who was appointed, was going to be appointed to a pro-vice chancellor position at Hong Kong U, but a campaign sort of led by the pro-Beijing press and certain pro-Beijing politicians led to him sort of having that offer withdrawn. They're now focusing their efforts on Benny Tai, another Hong Kong U professor who sort of led the Occupy movement, and are trying to force him to be removed from the university. So they engage in these kind of publicity-led political campaigns. And then on the other hand, you have, I guess, a dwindling number, but still a few sort of, broadly speaking, independent pro-democracy papers like the Apple Daily, and Ming Bao is arguably sort of a more neutral middle ground, although there's been some interference with editorial and management at Ming Bao as well in recent years. But at least until now, there has been a lively press in Hong Kong. Whether it continues or not depends partly on political pressures and partly on commercial pressures. The people still buy the papers and read them. So yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions if anybody has any. Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah. Maybe I should grab this. So you've kind of painted a pretty dark picture about Hong Kong's future, and I'm wondering if you could speak about some of the international pressures that Beijing might have to maintain Hong Kong as it is. And here I'm thinking about sort of Hong Kong as a soft, sort of as a place of soft power. Arguably, Hong Kong offers Beijing the soft power that it sort of craves in the international sphere. And do you think that's enough incentive for them to maintain Hong Kong?
Yeah, it had, and I can't help the feeling that a lot of Hong Kong's soft power has waned. If you think of Hong Kong cinema in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s, it was a huge part of sort of the Pan-Asian cinema. Or Canto Pop, for example, and its role in particularly overseas Chinese communities and in Greater China. Now I feel like K-pop is far more popular than Canto Pop, and Hong Kong cinema is largely seen as being far less lively than it used to be, and very much focused on co-productions with the mainland, where they can produce films that are going to sell in the mainland. So yeah, I think Hong Kong's soft power has faltered. And it's something that, it's a very good point. It's something that you think if the mainland was sort of, if Beijing was smart about it, they would focus on that. But I really feel like Taiwan is winning the soft power race in that regard, and that's sort of one of the things that sort of make it an attractive place for young Hong Kong people to want to immigrate to. There's something about Taiwanese culture that perhaps it's sort of it's more neutral space that is attractive. So yeah. Unfortunately, Beijing doesn't respond well to international pressure, direct international pressure on any issue, whether it's Hong Kong or anything else. And the UK has been signally reluctant to say anything about Hong Kong to China. But nevertheless, I think Beijing does have a sense of when people are watching or not. And they do moderate their behaviour based on, do they feel they're being observed and what they can get away with, I guess, to put it very bluntly. So yeah, there's a role for the international community to play, and I think certainly if Beijing wanted a role for Hong Kong to play on a broader international stage, but I feel like neither of those things is really being utilised to its fullest extent at the moment.
All right, well, if nobody else has any other questions. There's one more here. This is the last one. Very back.
Okay.
Thanks, Antony. My name is David, and I'm from Hong Kong, and I'm currently a PhD student in Sydney. I just have a question about the judiciary in Hong Kong.
I guess recent events have raised fear that amongst Hong Kongers that the independence of the judiciary is being undermined. And do you think it is already being undermined, or it eventually will be undermined anyway because it's not a representative democracy? And I know that there are judges from other common law jurisdictions presiding in the Court of Final Appeal in Hong Kong. Can they do anything about it, or what do they do anyway? Because I don't really know. Thanks.
Good questions. Independence of the judiciary is currently not under threat in Hong Kong. Certainly, there have been some questionable decisions, but I don't think those decisions have been externally imposed upon the courts. I think the courts are coming to those decisions on their own. A couple of things are going to be very important to watch. The judicial appointment process is very important to watch. Currently, the judicial appointment process is led by the Chief Justice. It's seen as being very reliable and politically neutral, and has, consistently selected the best candidates for the job. If there's any indication at all that there's any kind of political interference or questionable candidates start getting selected for judicial posts, that's going to be a very big warning sign, I think, for independence of judiciary in Hong Kong. The second warning sign, which you alluded to, is the role of the non-permanent foreign judges. So just by way of background, the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal, which is the highest court in the land in Hong Kong, has both local Hong Kong judges and also invites a limited number of senior judges from other common law jurisdictions. So former High Court justices from Australia, judges from the House of Lords in the UK, senior Canadian and New Zealand and South African judges have all been invited to sit on the bench and participate in ruling on Hong Kong appeal cases. The idea behind this is that it enables Hong Kong to continue to be integrated into the common law world and to sort of share its jurisprudence and get sort of, the experience and knowledge of the leading jurists around the world from other common law jurisdictions. And also, frankly, it's meant to be a reassurance to people that, there is these independent people sitting on the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal. They have the same powers as any other judge on the bench. And so they do exercise something of an independent oversight over the decision-making process. Occasionally you hear people on the pro-Beijing side speak out and saying things like, why do we have these foreigners sitting on our courts and we should scrap that system? I think if that system was scrapped and the foreign non-permanent judges were no longer invited to sit on Hong Kong court cases, that would be another warning sign that the judicial process is starting to be interfered with. So there are a couple of, so far so good, but there are certainly a couple of things to watch, and if they change, then that would certainly ring alarm bells. I should add that I've written a book, and you can purchase it here at the front, and I'll also sign it for you if you'd like me to. But thank you very much for coming to listen, and I hope you enjoyed the book.
Yes. Thank you, Antony. It's such a pleasure to have you here. And yes, please take a look at his book. It's down here at the front, everyone. And on behalf of the City Democracy Network, I have the chance to